What's going on, guys? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. This is pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A22 5G. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the strengths and weaknesses of this phone. Before we get started, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. That being said, let's get into the video. So my first pro for this phone is the camera. This phone has an 8 megapixel front-facing camera with a water drop notch. I'm usually not a big fan of the water drop notch, but this one actually doesn't look too bad, and the camera quality is really good. It takes pretty decent pictures for what it is. On the rear here, we have a triple camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. There's no macro camera, which some people might see as a drawback, but I personally don't think it's that big a deal. I don't really even know anyone who uses a macro camera. It's not too popular of a feature, I don't think. Now, that being said, there's always going to be somebody who wants a macro camera, and unfortunately in that situation, this will be a bit of a drawback. It would have been nice if this phone had a telephoto lens maybe, because then you could use it as a macro camera if you wanted, but also use it to take pictures of longer distance objects, so that might be cool. But as it is, for a mid-range phone, this camera setup is really pretty good. My second pro for this phone is the processor. This phone is getting 6 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 5G processor. Now keep in mind, there are other variants of this phone, and some may have less RAM. Depending on the carrier, sometimes they do cut that, but this specific variant of the phone in my hand does have 6 gigabytes of RAM. That being said, regardless, the processor is really good and really powerful. I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on the phone, and it came back with a single core score of 561 and a multi-core score of 1726. So this is really strong. You're going to be able to do pretty much anything you need to on this phone without too much trouble. Now, if you're getting into really high performance gaming, then it might struggle a little bit. Maybe editing a video with a large file, it might have a little trouble, but pretty much on a daily basis, you're gonna get real good performance from this phone. I've definitely had no issues. And when you're doing more basic things like browsing the web, maybe going on social media and that sort of thing, it's gonna be really good. Compared to other phones in its price range, there are not very many phones that are higher than this, so you're really getting a good deal here. My third pro for this phone is the battery. This phone has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery. This supports 15 watt fast charging. That's pretty impressive for several different reasons. First of all, if you have a more mobile lifestyle where you have to use your phone heavily throughout the day, but also don't have a ton of time to charge it, then having a large battery is gonna be real good, because with a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, you probably won't even have to charge this phone during the day. Having the fast charging means you're going to be able to charge this phone a lot more in a shorter period of time, so you'll be able to get going a lot faster. In addition to this, if you like to get one phone and keep it for a long time without having to replace it, having a larger battery is again going to come in handy. All batteries degrade, but you're not going to notice it nearly as quickly with a battery of this size. So as a result, you're not going to have to replace the phone nearly as quickly as you would with a phone that has a smaller battery. My fourth pro for this phone is the display. This phone has a 6.6 inch 90 Hz TFT display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 399, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So this phone has a real nice quality display. I have the brightness set to 100% and it looks really good, along with the design, really thin bezels, just an overall nice look all around. And a 6.6 inch display, while not being too far above average, is a little bit bigger than you typically see. I would personally say 6.5 inches is pretty much the norm for these phones. So this phone is a little bit bigger, and in addition to that, having a 1080p display with a 90 Hz refresh rate is really nice for stuff like videos, games, that sort of thing. Anything with motion on the screen, it's going to benefit from having a 90 Hz display as opposed to the typical 60 Hz display. My only potential complaint, if we're being real nitpicky about the display, is maybe a Super AMOLED display. Might have made the colors look a little better, but that's really just going out of my way to find a complaint about it. I really think this display is almost perfect, and for what it is, for this level of phone, it's pretty much among the best you can get. My fifth pro for this phone is the storage. This phone has 128 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so not only do you have a ton of space on the phone itself for apps, photos and videos, all kinds of information, but you can also put your photos and videos on an SD card, so you have even more space for apps and stuff. So if you're a power user, this is really going to come in handy for you, and even if you're not, it's always better to have more space than you think you need, because it's better to have too much space than run out. Now, my first con for this phone, I couldn't really find a ton of cons that I feel very strongly about for this phone, because for what it is, it's honestly just so good. Of course, there are going to be phones out there with better specs than it. This is not a flagship phone. This is very much a mid-level phone, but for a mid-level phone in this price range, I really couldn't find a lot wrong with it. But here are a few things that I think could be improved. First of all, there's no NFC. That is one thing that I don't really like about this phone. Right after I said it was almost perfect, right? Not having NFC is pretty much the one significant drawback of this phone. That feature, which in case you don't know, is responsible for stuff like Google Pay, Samsung Pay. If you're coming from iOS, Apple Pay, all those contactless mobile payment services are powered by a technology called NFC. And this phone, even though it's a brand new 5G phone with Android 11, with tons of nice features, a super powerful processor, all that kind of stuff, it doesn't have NFC. And I think that's kind of annoying because that feature is getting more and more widely used every day. And not having it on this phone is a bit of a drawback because lots of phones that are mid-level like this do have it. So it's really unfortunate that with this phone, you are gonna miss out on using those services. My second con for this phone is the video quality. Video quality in this phone is limited to 2K in the rear camera, also known as 1152p, and 1080p in the front camera. Now this isn't really bad per se, and I don't think the video quality in this in general is bad. You can take some pretty good videos with this phone, but I feel like they should have just given this phone the ability to shoot in 4K instead. I don't really get the point of 2K. It's barely better than 1080p in my opinion. It really doesn't even seem that much better than 1080p, and it's a weird number. I just think they should have at least given this phone 4K. Either that or just kept it at 1080p. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I'm really not a fan of this look, even though it's really not a big deal, especially on this phone where it's not too intrusive. It just could have been cleaner. The status bar, because of this, has a little blob in the middle of it that just bothers me, and I feel like having a water drop notch, like the Samsung Galaxy A22 does, would have been a lot better. Because after all, this phone does look a little bit similar to the A52 and the A52 5G, all that. Maybe a little bit skinnier if that's not my imagination, but the bottom line is, it's such a good design that they should have just stuck with that instead of continuing to use the water drop notch that just looks a little bit messier than it needs to be. My fourth con for this phone is that there's no wireless charging. Again, this is really nitpicky. I didn't expect wireless charging, but I still think it's a bit of a drawback because wireless charging is one of those features that's been around for a while, and I don't really get why they've incorporated everything else pretty much into the mid-level phones that aren't flagship phones, but not this feature. I've seen some entry-level phones with wireless charging, which is interesting. I'm always surprised every time I see it, but it's still really rare. I've even seen other flagship features on more normal mid-level phones. Like for example, the Samsung Galaxy A22 actually has a telephoto lens, if I can remember right. All kinds of mid-level phones are getting NFC, which again, unfortunately this phone doesn't even have that. And lots of mid-level phones like the Samsung Galaxy A52, for example, have some extra dust and water resistance. So I'm not sure why it's so rare for a mid-range phone to have wireless charging. So I do consider that a bit of a con, even if it's a pretty expected one. My fifth and final con for this phone is the materials. Now, once again, I still have to stress this is really not a huge con. it is a con altogether because I do like to play devil's advocate here and come up with some of the things that you might end up disliking about this phone. But that being said, even though the phone's materials aren't horrible, I've definitely seen worse, they still could be improved quite a bit. Even though the design does look really good, when you hold it, it doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it, so it feels a little bit lower quality than you might want. And I think it would have done really well with some metal, maybe some better glass, something like that to make it feel more premium, because even though this phone is a real nice phone, great display, great features, powerful processor, 5G phone, all the kinds of things that you might want in a phone, it just doesn't feel very premium, and I feel like they could improve this a little bit. But those were my pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A22 5G. I'm curious to see what you guys think of this phone so far. Do you think it's one of the better phones in 2021? Definitely let me know in the comments because I actually really want to know your opinion. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you want to learn more about the device itself, definitely check out my full review of the phone on the channel. And if you happen to be watching this after you already bought the phone, I do have a beginner's guide and a tips and tricks video where I go over a bunch of different features for this phone that you might not know about yet. But that's it for this video. As always, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.